Welcome back to Missing. I am Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing okay today, Tim. We have an interesting episode coming up for everybody to listen to. I'm doing okay because it's been 19 years since the disappearance of Brianna Maitland, and that is what this episode is primarily focused on. Before we get to it, Tim, how are you?
I'm doing okay as well, Lance. Yes, it's a bit of a solemn day here. It is the 19-year anniversary of the disappearance of Brianna Maitland. Of course, Brianna Maitland went missing from Montgomery, Vermont on March 19th, 2004. Her vehicle was found about a mile away from her workplace where she had just left a shift at the Black Lantern. And if you have any information in Brianna's case, you can call 1-844-848-8477.
And be sure to check out investigationsforthemissing.org. That's a nonprofit that Brianna's father started to help families investigate their missing loved ones' cases when police and law enforcement are no longer able to. This is an organization that he started in honor of Brianna, and Tim and I have the privilege of being on the board of that. So if you want to support that, go to investigationsforthemissing.org.
Yeah, and we'll hear from Bruce Maitland, Brianna's father, in the second half of this episode. There's a segment that Jennifer Amell produced a couple of years ago with Bruce, and they talk about private investigations for the missing quite a bit. And so you can find out more information about them at investigationsforthemissing.org. The first half of this conversation, Lance, is us speaking with private investigator Lou Barry, who has worked on the case for several years and has been on our airwaves on our Missing Brianna Maitland series several times now.
That's right, and he's more than welcome to come back anytime with any sort of update, whether it's a big update, a small update, or even an update that he wants to tell us but can't. And he'll shut us down anytime we try to dig a little bit deeper. But that's reassuring because that's why we know he's such a good investigator. And if you want to commemorate the anniversary of Brianna's disappearance, March 19th, feel free to light a candle or make a post on social media in any way that you see fit. While it feels like a small gesture, a lot of people doing that goes a long way with family members and friends.
All right, and you can follow us on social media at Missing CSM. Thanks a lot for listening, everybody. We'll be right back with private investigator Lou Barry. Welcome, Lou Barry, to the podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing great, thank you, and thanks for having me on.
Of course. I feel like in the past couple of weeks, we're like besties. We see each other all the time now between board meetings and other case updates, and you're joining us today to talk a little bit of DNA and Brianna Maitland, so thanks for that, and I think the listeners are going to get a lot out of this conversation.
Okay, so let's start with Brianna Maitland. How long have you been working on her case?
I believe I started sometime late 2016, early 2017. Got involved. I was familiar with the case when it first came out just because I have ties up in Vermont, and I'd seen the case and it looked interesting. But at the time I was working full-time, so it wasn't really anything that I had a vested interest in or was able to work on. But when I had a kind of a downtime, a slow time in doing investigations down here, it kind of rekindled my interest in that case. And we met with Bruce, her father, and offered assistance. And he was very thankful, grateful, I guess is the best word, and told me about Greg, who had been working on a case much longer than I have, back in 2006 or 7. So he's got another 10 years into it than I have. We met up in the western part of Mass and went over the whole case, and I was impressed with the amount of effort that had been put in by him all on his own time. It was just an interesting case. There was just so many facets to it. So it took me probably 6 months just to familiarize myself with who was who and what had been done and what hadn't been done, just because there was so much information out there. It's a very complicated case, very lengthy case. And the state police had done an incredible amount of work on it. I had a meeting with the major crime unit up there. Actually, I had 2 meetings with them. Developed a very good rapport with them, and since that time have been exposed to much of what they've done. Not everything, because they've just done so much, but they've really put a lot of time and effort into this case.
So Brianna disappeared on March 19th, so we're coming up on the anniversary, March 19th, 2004.
That would be 19 years, correct?
19 years. After all of this time, and you just said there's so much information, Greg and Bruce and the independent investigation put together so much information, there's so many facets, the police, law enforcement has so much information. Do you ever get caught up in this feedback loop of like, why hasn't this been solved after so long and so much information? Like, how does that not just make you want to pull your hair out?
It certainly can be frustrating, and I think one of the most frustrating aspects of it to myself, and I am certain to the state police that are working on it, is that information that has been investigated and found to be irrelevant or not relevant or not important, resurfaces a year, 2, 3, 5, 7, 8 years later, and but it's changed a little bit. It's like the old game of telephone tag. So now that has to be relooked at, and it is very time-consuming, drains resources. You obviously don't want to turn down any lead or potential lead, yet on the other hand, sometimes that can get very frustrating. Reinvestigating things that have already been investigated just because somebody puts a little twist on the information, if that makes any sense.
And so you are a current private investigator. Greg is also a current licensed private investigator. You both still work with Bruce, Brianna's father, on this case and for private investigations for the missing. You both volunteer your time as private investigators to private investigations for the missing, the nonprofit that Bruce has founded. I know the anniversary of the disappearance can be tough for Bruce. How's he doing as far as emotionally and with the investigation right now?
I think he's handling it a lot better than many people would. He's very matter of fact about it. He understands the situation. I'm sure this is a very difficult time of year for the family, and I wish we had some real good news for him. These investigations are a series of highs and lows, and you have what you think is a good lead, and then all of a sudden you find out it's not such a good lead, and then things are quiet for a while, and then something else comes in and you're hot on that, and then that peters out. So it's imagine for an investigator, it's like a roller coaster. I can't even imagine what it's like for family members. But Tim, one thing you mentioned I wanted to point out, Greg and I do, yes, and we investigate Brianna's case for Bruce. And we also investigate and work on cases for PI for the missing. But those are two separate entities. Bruce started PI for the missing, and he has been meticulous about keeping Brianna's case away from that organization because he doesn't want it to look like they're raising funds for his investigation. So anything we do for Bruce is outside PI for the missing and funded totally by Bruce, not by the organization. So I just think that's important because some people might get the wrong impression there that that's why the organization exists, and it's contrary to that completely.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought that up because whenever we talk about that and how Bruce started it, we try to emphasize that he started it because of his daughter, or he started it in honor of his daughter, and this is to help other families. And he's done a remarkable job maintaining a very clear directive against all of the growing pains of starting a nonprofit because there's no money. There's never money. You're always raising money. You're always trying to raise money. You're always trying to spread the word and network, and you're always trying to do the job as well. And there's never been a frustrating moment that we can see when we have these board meetings where he just throws his hands up and wants to give up. He never seems to want to do that. He always maintains this direct line. And you said that he's handling it very well. There's so much there. 19 years, the nonprofit, and I mean, Tim and I have seen firsthand other people who have missing loved ones not handle it well at all. And that's just something that I don't know where he gets that from, but it's just something I've always looked at like in admiration. How can you just maintain that steady path through all of it?
I think Bruce understands what other families go through, and no matter what the ultimate resolution of Brianna's case, as long as someone is investigating it, which they are, both, the law enforcement authorities and the private investigators, there's always hope that he'll get an answer. And I think that's what he realizes is important to families, and that's why he started the organization, was to allow them, other families, an opportunity to have the knowledge that someone cares and is still looking at the case. And I run into the cases a lot because I review them for private investigation for the missing. When I talk to the law enforcement agency, if they respond, oh yeah, we can't release that report because it's policy. Yet with the volume of cases they have, they're not doing anything. No one is looking at that case, and I feel really bad for the families, and under those circumstances, because if law enforcement isn't working on it and the private investigators aren't working on it, then it's by pure chance if anyone solves it. Somebody's got to care, I guess, is the final answer on that, final word on that.
Yeah, that's true. In Brianna's case, Othram Labs has stepped in a little bit to try and assist with a DNA angle. And this is something that happened, I guess, a couple of years ago first, and then there were some results. Can you take us through this stage, Lou?
Well, there was some potential evidence that was out on the scene that contained DNA that had been unidentified and ultimately was submitted by the state police into Othram Lab, and they, in fact, identified the source of the DNA. The individual who was identified has absolutely zero involvement in this case whatsoever. He was totally non-involved, just happened to have his DNA at the scene. In that case, I think the participation of Othram was extremely important for a number of reasons. Number one, it prevented the state police from having to spend a lot of resources in identifying a subject that wasn't involved. And secondly, it potentially cleared an individual who could have been felt to be a suspect at some point by identifying him and providing, obtaining information that eliminated him as a possibility. So, it's an aspect of Othram's that we don't think about. We think about Othram using their genomic sequencing to identify a suspect or to identify an unidentified individual. But in this case, their expertise was utilized to eliminate a potential suspect by identifying him and saving that individual a lot of, involvement, unfounded, and saved the state police a lot of work that would have been fruitless in the end.
Now, how can you say with such certainty that this is not someone who was a suspect? If I'm not mistaken, the DNA was taken from the crime scene, right?
Yes, from the area of the crime. Although we really don't have a crime scene, we have a scene where her vehicle was left. Whether that's the closest we have to a crime scene, and there was some DNA located in that vicinity, but the individual, and I don't really want to get into too much what was done and what wasn't done, but he's been eliminated as a suspect.
But this isn't someone who was on the radar previously, right?
Absolutely not, no.
Okay. So this isn't the kind of thing where this DNA matched someone who was on the radar. This is someone who did not match anybody on the radar, and Othram was able to identify that person, and then that person's alibi was very strong.
I assume that's the case with the alibi, but yes, they were not associated with the case, except for the fact that their DNA happened to be located at the scene. But that doesn't, people immediately jump to a conclusion that it isn't accurate in this case. Just because DNA is there, it doesn't necessarily mean that person is involved.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good to mention that probably a lot of the work that Othram does involves eliminating people based on the DNA. And when you hear about this, and great point saying this isn't a crime scene, because we slip and say that quite a bit because we see what the scene looks like based on the pictures.
I think it's debatable. No offense, Lou.
Ooh, shots fired.
Well, I guess I'm looking at it from the perspective that by the time the police were involved, the scene had most likely been contaminated from the state it was in when whatever happened. The vehicle was gone. So the location is known, but what occurred there and what evidence may or may not have been there is unknown.
So this could be somebody who perhaps Brianna gave a ride to a week ago, and that person was on vacation during the time of her disappearance.
I suppose that's one alternative.
Yeah.
Or it could have been someone who threw something out of their car and
Yep.
it was at that location. I mean, DNA can be from a number of sources. So,
And what about the time frame? Was the DNA by that person left around the time of Brianna's disappearance, or is that not exactly known?
it was located around the time of her disappearance. I don't think the exact date that it was left in the area is known. And again, I think the state has kept what it is and who it is and everything under wraps, and there's no reason not to, because it's not relevant, and they know it's not relevant. So it's a moot point at this point. It just doesn't apply. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
Except for the public curiosity, which is not the business they're in. Yeah.
Right. But I'm glad we cleared it up. I think as best we could do without going too far. Now, what about the 11 persons of interest that the DNA was apparently run against? Can you talk about that at all?
Well, I can surmise who those 11 people are, but I have never seen a list of persons of interest. And I think if, in fact, one of those persons of interest did it, there's 10 that didn't. So to make public or anything, any of those names would be unfair to people that are not involved, because it's just, potentially destroying someone's reputation for no reason, being unfounded. And I've seen it in other cases, not related to this one at all, where an individual was, suspected to be involved. It wasn't involved, and it was proven that he wasn't involved, and because an arrest was made and a conviction was obtained by somebody else. Yet, for years, this individual had fingers pointed at him that, oh yeah, he did it. We know he did it, and he must have done it, and he didn't do it. So, again, I understand it's frustrating for the people that are interested in the cases and everything not to be, aware of every particular detail, but there's reasons for that, and they should understand that it's not that nothing is being done or that they're deliberately trying to mislead the public. It's that it's not the way you do things. You don't publicly throw people out there. There's enough of that done by the public without law enforcement doing it.
Right. That's our job. Leave that to us. And well, I to be honest, when I first read that about 11 persons of interest that they compared the DNA against, I was really excited, because I was like, wow, they've developed 11 persons of interest. That seems like a lot. Like, I think we actually went through who we imagined those 11 people to be, and I think we got to like 8 or something like that. But I have no idea on the accuracy. But my question is, when Vermont State Police puts that out there about 11 persons of interest that they compared DNA against, does that mean that they've collected DNA for Brianna's case specifically from those 11 people, or is that 11 people that were on their radar that they could find their DNA in CODIS?
I do not have an answer for that. I do not know.
Anytime something like that is put into the public, I guess, put out there to the public by law enforcement, is this maybe a tactic that they might use to, if they're looking at certain individuals, to see how they behave after something like that is out there in the public?
I suppose it could have been. But I don't think that would be normal procedure. I mean, I don't believe so. I think the reason it was put out there was because there's been so much attention paid to the case, that and it was big news that they were sending off this DNA, and particularly in light of the past few years, Othram's involvement in these cold cases that they've been knocking off in the span of 2 or 3 a week sometimes. It's just incredible. So I think it's one of the one's a reflection of how much time, effort, and expense they're putting into this case. That they, sent this off to Othram to have it analyzed, and these are, it's not a cheap thing to do. It's an expensive proposition, and you have to have the DNA to do it. And that's, I think, where Othram and labs like them are so valuable, because you can have all the DNA in the world, and if you don't have a suspect, then you forget it. And as you well know, in the town I was chief in, they just solved, not we, they just solved a 44-year-old homicide, at least identified the victim of a 44-year-old homicide through genomic sequencing 44 years later. So it's, it's incredible what the work they're doing out there really is.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
So next year is going to be 20 years, and that's a round number, and 2 decades. Where do you think we're going to be after 20 years?
I'd like to say we have a suspect and he's in custody. There's 2 different perspectives here. One is that of Bruce and the family, is to find out what happened, and that's basically what we're doing for him. As private investigators, we don't arrest people, we don't charge people, we don't do anything else. All we do is try and figure out what happened, and then if it's something that has enough evidentiary value to turn over to the police, then they take it from there. So that's our perspective, is find out what the heck happened. And obviously the police perspective is find out what happened and find out who did it and then bring them to justice. So they go a little bit further than we do, obviously. But so I'd like to say, we could figure out what happened to her, and oftentimes that will lead to the second part of who did it. But I think at this point, the family's priority is to find out what happened. That's, it's been 20 years. God knows if whoever did it is still alive even. I mean, that's another thing. In this case I just mentioned, the 44-year-old, the person of interest is deceased. And has been for quite some time. So certainly the family, however, is, they know, the children know what happened to their mother now, which is to them the most important thing. You can't punish a dead person. So
I assume it's going to be a combination of scientific research, DNA, and I guess, to use a cliche, old-fashioned detective work. But in your opinion, what is more important? What would be the more important discovery? Something that was directly connected to Brianna's person found somewhere, or the identification of a suspect through DNA?
Well, I don't think you could do number 2 without number 1. You got to have the DNA to identify it. I guess my strong assumption is any DNA that's at the scene of any value has been identified and is no longer assumed to be applicable to the case. So that precludes that. So any DNA now that is found would have to be found, where she was or her clothing was or something. Now, you'll also run into the problem over time. DNA does erode or is not as viable over time. So even if DNA is discovered, can you then extract enough to identify who that might belong to? That's a different question completely, obviously. I mean, you never know. These cases could be solved in a number of ways. She could be found. Bodies are found if she is in fact deceased years later, and who knows what might be at the scene that might help identify, depending on where she is and what was there, etc. A witness could come forward that isn't at this point known to us, or hasn't at this point come forward. I mean, we don't know whether 1 people, 2 people, whoever the perp was, did he tell somebody? Did he not tell somebody? I mean, we don't know any of those things for sure. So that's another way it could be solved. Or number 3, somebody could confess. I mean, people, sometimes do things that you would say, wow, why would they do that? But, someone perhaps on their deathbed, someone who's has a guilty conscience, someone who gets religion. I mean, there's a number of reasons why people might all of a sudden come forward. Maybe this person's done other things and, wants to cleanse their soul, so to speak. I don't know. I wouldn't be in to speak on people's motives sometimes. But so I think there's still hope out there that this case will be solved. That's why we're still working on it.
Yeah.
There's a key out there somewhere. It's just a matter of finding out what it is. And so
Right.
that's what keeps us going.
Yeah, well, can you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing lately and what the rest of 2023 holds for your investigation?
I try and keep in contact with the people on the periphery, friends, associates. We still get tips from time to time, which we follow up on. Greg and I will, independently, because he's in New York, obviously, I'm in Massachusetts, so we don't see each other all the time, but we'll both go through our files and, I'll get a call from Greg and say, hey, I was just reading this. What do you think about this? And do you think, was this ever followed up on? And, so going back and seeing if we missed something, misread something, maybe put something aside for the time and forgot about it. I mean, that happens. And sometimes, you can go months without anything, and then bang, you get some information, and then it's, you're back into it again. But, the folder sits on the desktop of my computer, along with a couple others, and from time to time, I'll open it up and look at some stuff and go back and re-verify some information that we had. And, the funny, I guess it's not a funny thing, but the difficulty in these cases many times is because so much time goes past, not only from the incident, but even from how long I've been involved in it, and even longer for Greg, is you forget things. And you reread something and say, I don't remember that. And so you have to keep refreshing your memory. And I can't even imagine what it's like for the state police, because they've had, different investigators over the years, and they've got a file room full of files. And as more time goes by, the harder and harder it gets. And people's memories are just, they're not good. I mean, witnesses are bad enough when they're fresh. Eyewitnesses are not that reliable, unfortunately. And you throw in 5, 10, 15, 20 years of time that goes by, and their memory is even worse. It's just a fact, a human fact. That's all. So that can make it difficult, but we just do the best we can. That's all.
Hopefully next year we're back here, maybe talking about some development, something aside from what are we going to do next year when it's 21 years. So I think we're moving in the right direction.
I will say this: the case is not sitting there dormant. I mean, there are things that are being done, and there are still active angles that are being explored, particularly by the state police. So it's not like this case is just sitting there and nobody's doing anything with it. Believe me, it's still a priority, I would say, with investigators, because it is solvable. I mean, it is a solvable case. There's not a lot to go on, but there's still avenues that need to be explored. And we've had people say, "Wow, it looks this person looks really good," and then you find out that they not so good after all. As a suspect. But I think the important thing is to keep it fresh by things like your podcast here, to keep it in people's minds so that they know, number one, it's not forgotten, and maybe somebody has information out there that has, again, for one reason or another, never come forward, that could bring that little piece of information and solve the case. And I keep going back to this case that we just had in town here a few days ago that was finally publicly solved. But that one identification of a niece of the deceased, and within a very short period of time, the police did an amazing job of following up, getting witnesses, tracking down people, tracing the path of where this victim was, and just absolutely incredible. But you needed that one little piece to get the ball rolling. And once that was done, it was, the scientific aspect started it, and then the nitty-gritty police work kind of finished it off.
Very cool. All right. Well, thank you very much, Lou, for chatting with us here today. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you guys for the service you provide to these cases, to the families of these victims, because that's the real upside of the way the media is today, is that you can get the word out. 20 years ago, even, this stuff didn't exist. People outside the immediate area knew nothing of these cases, and now that's obviously totally changed, and can really make a big impact on them.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. And now here's a segment that Crawlspace Media's Jennifer Amell put together a couple of years ago with Bruce Maitland about his journey and about the nonprofit Private Investigations for the Missing.
How I kind of deal with my daughter's disappearance, I describe it as a room that I go into with a lot of memories, and it's difficult sometimes to deal with those memories. And I knew that starting an organization like this, that kind of stuff would have to come up. So it took a while before I was mentally ready to be able to do that. You have to make something good come out of all this. And the best way that I knew to make something good come out of Brianna being missing was to help other people.
Everything changed for Bruce Maitland when his daughter Brianna Maitland vanished after leaving her job at the Black Lantern Inn in Montgomery, Vermont on March 19, 2004. I'm Tim Pilleri.
And I'm Lance Reenstierna, and we are the hosts of the podcast Missing, which covers the stories of missing persons.
We also have the privilege of sitting on the board of the nonprofit Private Investigations for the Missing.
Private Investigations for the Missing was founded by Bruce Maitland. But that's not how we met Bruce. We actually met him back in 2016 when we were covering another mysterious and eerily similar disappearance for our show Missing Maura Murray.
Back then, the nonprofit didn't exist yet, and Bruce was understandably a little guarded when it came to opening up about his personal tragedy to a couple of podcasters. So here's a clip from our second ever episode on Brianna's case.
He said things during a conversation that wasn't recorded that he kind of brought up during our interview where, Brianna is in a little room in a box in his head. He doesn't want to open this up. So he prefers at this point to not talk about Brianna as his daughter, as a person. He wants to talk about the case, and said he will answer as much as he possibly can, but he has shut off a lot of the memories that he's had. He not intentionally, he just said, it was a tough time. It was a terrible time. And he doesn't remember a lot of what happened in the immediate few months and years around that time.
We've been covering this case for 5 years now, and in honor of the 17th anniversary of Brianna's disappearance, it seems like Bruce might finally be getting closer to some answers.
Brianna Maitland was born on October 8th, 1986, so that made her 17 years old when she went missing from the old Dutchburn house, which was basically a boarded-up, abandoned house about a mile away from where she was working as a dishwasher at the Black Lantern Inn.
By all accounts, she left work at about 11 p.m. that night, and her car was found backed up into the side of this broken-down building. The rear of the car, the trunk of the car, was almost hung up onto the foundation of the building, and anyone who is interested or has researched true crime and has seen that picture, you'll see how it says a million things but really says nothing at the same time. It really stands out as a picture of a true tragedy. Something really wrong happened that night.
Yeah, the car must have been backed up in a certain way and at a certain speed to have hit the house, the abandoned house, and to get hung up onto it. And so I know a lot of web sleuths and law enforcement has looked at these photos and looked at the tire tracks and really tried to put these pieces together. And it is still confusing after all these years.
That's correct. There have been a lot of theories about what happened, how that car could have gotten there, and where she went after that car crashed into the back of the home. Was there somebody in her back seat? Were there people following her in another car? Were there people waiting for her at a certain distance down the road by that house and caused her to back into there? People have looked at the tires and how the wheel was turned, and was she trying to back up and then around a car to get out of there? So many questions come from that picture, and yet it's almost 17 years later, and here we are again with absolutely no sighting, no credible evidence to Brianna's whereabouts.
And no shortage of kind of shady characters surrounding her at that point of her life. And we've produced about 15 episodes on Brianna's case, and we have spoken about a lot of those characters. And we spoke to some of Brianna's friends, and I think those interviews are really interesting. They go back a few years now, but her friends were well aware of who she was hanging out with and who was in their circle, and it still seems like the truth is being hidden.
And that happens to a lot of people in these situations, these missing person situations. They do get involved with these elements that take them down. A lot of people get out of them, but some people have the unfortunate circumstance of falling too deep into these situations. And that's what Bruce wants to do with Private Investigations for the Missing, is try to give something back to these families and make something good come out of his own daughter's tragedy.
Bruce was pretty frustrated, and really still is, by the investigation or lack thereof from the Vermont State Police. And that led him to start speaking with private investigators. Greg Overacker, who, Lance, he's become our friend too. He reached out to Bruce not long after Brianna went missing. He saw Brianna's missing poster while he was on the thruway in New York, and his heart just went out to the family, and he reached out. And they've been friends and been working on this case ever since. And really, throughout conversations between them, it led to Bruce having the idea about Private Investigations for the Missing, because private investigators are not cheap, Lance.
And when you're talking about these expenses, a lot of these underserved families aren't able to cover that. And that's why their loved one continues to stay missing, because now they're not even a priority for the law enforcement as well.
And we recently sat down with Bruce to speak about what is going on with Private Investigations for the Missing. We are approaching 17 years missing for Brianna, and I just wondering how you're feeling at this point.
Seems like it was a whole lifetime ago, and there's times when it just seems like it was yesterday. It's just kind of a weird back and forth on it.
One of the things that we often tell people is, and we sort of do it in a bragging way, and I hope you don't mind, but we say what you've done with Brianna's disappearance and taken that to Private Investigations for the Missing is so impressive to us, and we often tell people, you are the best example of taking something tragic and trying to make something good out of it in the best way you can. And you saw a need for this. A lot of other people, know that there's a drop-off with the priority. When someone is missing, it's so quick. When someone goes missing and law enforcement doesn't have something within a certain period of time, there's a drop-off. And what you want to do is make sure that doesn't happen anymore.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor. Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. Was there a time that the Vermont State Police gave you the indication that Brianna's case was no longer a priority?
Oh, they never said that to me. By their actions at times, that's what I took, that it, had slipped down to obviously a lower level. Yeah. And that time probably came, it was a priority for a few months, and then it became a kind of a what I thought was a lower priority. Then about 2 years later, I felt that they did a lot more work on it, and then it was just been kind of a when they have time, and that kind of remains so to this day.
So it was sort of an on-again, off-again situation, and when it became an on-again situation, did it feel like there was just a little bit less energy put into it, or maybe someone new was approaching it, so they needed to be debriefed, and that took a little bit longer? Is that kind of how it felt?
Well, I think it was mostly in response to information that they would receive. I've said this before, I guess, in the past, but I mean, they have a, police in general, and I think this is, nationwide, and I'm not knocking the Vermont State Police, but they obviously, they have a reactive time, what I call reactive time, and that's right away. If you're fortunate. Sometimes that doesn't happen right away either, but they do have a reactive time where they're actively trying to pursue leads and trying to solve it and things like that, and then it goes into kind of a semi-reactive time where they only react to information as they get it. They don't actively try to go out and pursue leads, and then it goes cold. And then during those cold times, nothing happens until a new piece of information comes, and then, different police departments respond to it differently. Some of them will hop right on it, and some of them just get to a point where they don't even care about looking at it. It's back in the corner of a file somewhere, and that's where it sits until somebody like our organization gets involved and gets kind of some groundwork started and maybe turns up some interest in heat, and then it goes back into the reactive stage again.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that they turn up some heat on it. And you said previously that it took 14 years before you made sort of the conscious decision to start this organization, and that was with private investigator Greg Overacker, who's one of the heroes of Crawlspace. How did that conversation happen? And I'm kind of wondering about the genesis of, like, physically speaking those words with Greg and saying, what do we have to do next? And did you see these examples happening throughout the 14 years where maybe something came to your attention that you wanted something to be followed up on, and then you realized, wow, I have to go pay somebody to do this?
Because Greg didn't live in the area where Brianna disappeared, we would have discussions on, when I would have Greg go up to Vermont to do some work for me. Greg, to his credit, I mean, he would only ever charge me for the expenses to go up there. Even so, I mean, it was a lot of money. So what we ended up having to do, and this is a case no person that has a loved one out there should really have to do, but you end up kind of prioritizing that. You can't afford to send a guy up there and say, just go on up there, Greg, and here's all these people that should be talked to and be interviewed. You end up saying, well, I guess we'll have to maybe, prioritize this one over that one, or leave this one go. In the TV world, no stone goes unturned in crime shows. They just do it all up and wrap it all up in an hour. Well, that's not how it really works. When I could see, with that, it kind of, the idea begins to evolve as it's like, hey, there's just so many other people, even in worse situations than I am, that don't have any access to this. The need is just tremendous, and no one else is really doing it. I mean, we're it.
And even to us as board members, there's a whole end of it that we don't really see. And one of those things we found out live on the air, that you speak with Nikki Johnson regularly, more often than we would have realized. And Nikki, of course, her dad, Archer Ray Johnson, went missing back in 1986 from Brooklyn, Washington.
Yeah, he's been so helpful to me just in my own emotions and feelings.
Well, that is really great to hear. Have you spoken with him?
Yeah, we've talked once a week or so on the phone. And he helps validate how I feel. And I don't know, it's just, you guys have been, I'll say this, even if we don't get to the bottom of it, you guys have been helpful. I mean, I guess I feel like I'm not alone.
Good. Good.
That is
And-
great to hear. Yeah. That's news to us, by the way. I did not know that you and Bruce spoke. I mean, that's how many sort of moving parts there are to PS for the missing. And everyone's got a goal and they're working on it. And we don't even hear about it all. So it's really awesome when we actually hear something like that.
I guess what leads you to do that? Why do you pick up the phone and have those conversations?
Well, I mean, there's no better way in my mind to help someone than the help comes from someone that's actually stood in their shoes at some point. You know, Nikki's a really brave person for taking this on, and you know, I just wanted to help her in any way I could. You know, and not just in the case part of it, but more so in the dealing with her feelings. I have this, you know, this or that is going through my mind, or I feel this or that way. And I was able to validate that for her. There's people out there that need help in more ways than just a private investigator. And what bit I can do, you know, I'm willing to do that.
So it's fair to say that your experience after years of living through the disappearance of your daughter, that led you directly to create this private investigations for the missing because you felt there was a need out there.
Yes, because your other alternative was to pay short-term stuff to private eyes to, and this is what I've learned myself in talking with other people around the country. I mean, your other alternative is to pay a PI, which you can't afford on any kind of long-term basis. So you end up paying them to do specific tasks or something like that, and you know, there's just not enough money for that, and it's just a terrible situation. And then you hear of people that have lost their whole life savings, you know, to try to find their missing loved one, because you'll do about anything. I think it really, the idea just kind of started with that it's like, oh my gosh, all these other people out here have had bad experiences or have just had zero help. I mean, the truth is, it was probably 14 years after Brianna went missing before I could bring myself to do this. So it took a long. It's a big step for me, even now, sometimes, to kind of, because you have to. I thought about it for probably a year before I actually did anything about it too. So, and because you realize that there's certain things that you go through that you're going to have to go through in your own mind, and it's what I call the hard road. It's not taking the easy road in dealing with Brianna's disappearance. But it's something that has to be, I felt at some point you just get this overwhelming, this has just got to be done and it has to happen. And, you know, I'm going to pursue this in the same way that I've pursued, continue looking for Brianna. There's a certain pain that comes out of it every time, but you learn to deal with it, just like you learn to deal with other things in life that happen to you. You know, it's just, that's the way it is. So that's why I call it the hard road. You know, it's not easy. And I don't mean to denigrate other people that have, you know, missing children and missing loved ones. I mean, for choosing another road. I really don't, because everyone has to deal with it. There's, you know, I've learned everybody deals with it differently, and that's all okay, because they're all out there doing the best they can.
And then you mentioned some people and you know, through their no fault of their own, and you said there were times when you travel down that road where you get depressed, and so that in my head it looks like a dead end, right? So then you have to kind of claw through that and travel further and get back on that hard road, but at least you're traveling forward, right? Like at least it's going to a destination, and I feel like that's the case with the nonprofit as well. Is it looking like that for you when you take a step back? Do you see the organization becoming this engine to travel this road? Ha! That was a great metaphor.
Well, I mean, as you guys know, I mean, my dream is to have this as a nationwide organization. I would like to help as many people as possible. So that's always been the goal that's out there, and that remains the goal. I see no end to growth. You know, even years down the road, if I'm not around anymore, I want to see the mission continue. So there's no end to it. The mission is pretty simple, really, though. It's that we want to be able to provide at no cost PIs to help families find their missing loved ones. You know, if there was a one sentence definition, that would be it. and it gets a little more complicated and nuanced as we go on. And all these other connections that you just spoke about, they kind of come out as a benefit. Stuff that's happened that's really surprised me. But, it's a very simple mission. There's just so many people that need help, and we want to try to help them out in any way we can. And then it becomes, part of what you guys do, Tim and Lance, and obviously what the PIs are doing behind the scenes. I try to help out where I can, and all the volunteers. It's great. I mean, it's almost every day somebody needs some help, and we'd love to be able to help them all.
But there is hope for Brianna's case. Othram Labs has been working with DNA samples taken from the crime scene.
Through the work that we've done with Bruce and with private investigations for the missing, we've had companies like Othram reach out to us to offer their help. And Othram is, according to their website, the first private laboratory built to apply the power of modern parallel sequencing to forensic evidence. In short, that means that they decipher genetic identities so these missing person cases can be solved. And Brianna's case is one that is in their pipeline. They're currently working on it, and we will provide updates as they come to us.
For a deep dive into Brianna Maitland's case and many more stories like hers, listen to our show, Missing, on the Crawlspace Media Network.